Good morning, everyone, to this new episode of The Next Page, our podcast designed to advance the conversation on multilateralism. Today we have a bookcast episode together with Dr. Rebecca Adami on Women and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is actually the title of one of her books published by Routledge in 2019. And we're bringing this to the fore for two good reasons. First of all, the gender historical analysis and perspective on the role of women in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And secondly, because this year, 2023, is the 75th anniversary of that declaration. And so we thought we would like to shine a light from a gender perspective on the declaration. And actually, the book goes a long way into explaining how these women that Rebecca will describe to us had a role in pushing for a more inclusive language than the right of man, which is what the initial negotiations were going for. So the book provides this very good gender historical narrative of human rights from the San Francisco Conference, actually, in 1945, until the final negotiations in December 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So big welcome to you, Rebecca. Welcome to our podcast. We're going to explore your book today, so thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here.
That's great. It's great to have you. We're recording this over video call, so we hope that this is going to be fine for the audience. So, Rebecca, please tell our audience a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in gender and the history of international relations, and in particular the history of the Universal Declaration, what pushed you to study this and finally publish this very interesting book, Women and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Thank you. So I'm really interested in human rights and human rights studies, both philosophical discussions, critical discussions about the concept of human rights. I was asking a lot of questions in relation to literature that I read. A lot of critiques against the universality of human rights, a lot of thinkers wanting to redefine human rights, stating that there was no universal acceptance of these human rights that had been listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of philosophers drawing back the history of rights to a very Western and European history. I was inspired by feminist and post-colonial critiques against human rights, but also wondering whether there was like an empirical basis for such critiques. I was wondering when I started this work, and this dates back to more than 10 years ago when I was writing my dissertation on human rights learning. I myself, when I read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's written in a kind of abstract and not so emotional language. It's difficult to maybe relate to the articles in the declaration. And I was wondering, if you're working as a teacher in a classroom or discussing human rights in other like non-formal educational settings, how would you feel addressed by human rights? Would you feel that by reading the declaration that these are only built on an idea of a Western individual, or do they really, do these notions really relate to people in different contexts? Because there are no references to religion or different cultural backgrounds or sentiments in the declaration, of course. So I wanted to look into the actual, archival materials and meeting protocols from the debates when the declaration, but also the UN Charter was being discussed, and what I found was a very fascinating historical narrative that countered the critique that has been leveled against human rights as being only Western and male concept, and also countered the idea that there were only white colonial male delegates and subjects at these debates and deliberations about human rights. What I found was a counter-narrative, and I've been intrigued and very inspired by the women delegates from different countries that I felt that I met through these meeting protocols. And initially I was a little bit frustrated because their names were not really spelled out. They were only referred to as Mrs. or Miss so-and-so, and then their husband's last name. So women had been really written out, even out from official UN documents and meeting protocols by just referring to Mrs. so-and-so, last name of their husbands. So I had to do a lot of digging and researching into the backgrounds of these very fascinating women, and finding that these were women who had been part of resistance movements in their countries against colonial oppression, and they had paid a high price for really fighting for human rights in reality. And they were met by, of course, a majority of male delegates at these debates at the UN who maybe initially felt like, oh, human rights, this is a great idea, and this is something that even colonial powers had championed. But in the abstract, when they realized that human rights would be used against their power interest, against oppression, against male privilege, then a lot of delegates backed on this notion. And this is something that you will see if you look into material also after the declaration was being adopted, because then people had a faith in these words and used them in order to, petition to the United Nations, the Trusteeship Council, saying that, well, look, this colonial administration is oppressing people. This is a violation of human rights. You need to respect the universality of human rights, etc., etc. So this was a really revolutionary idea that people would have rights regardless of their legal and social status in society. So I think it's so fascinating and it's so inspiring to read the debates, the struggles and the conflicts behind these seemingly abstract notions in the declaration, because behind every word there is a certain meaning, and behind this meaning there is life. It's a struggle between wanting the wording to be as inclusive as possible, or excluding people due to religion or gender or race, and I will go into some of these debates. But for me, I gained a renewed hope and a really strong belief in both in the United Nations as a platform for negotiations and diplomatic discussions, and in human rights as a very forceful idea and ideal that can be used and claimed by people. And this is something that I think repressive regimes and governments will notice all over the world when people use human rights and claim them in their context. It will challenge power structures and political agendas. And I think it's just very fascinating to draw, parallels from the history to the present and to current debates, because they are also repeating and ongoing.
Absolutely. This is what this episode is for. Before we delve into and we dive into actually the overview of your book, you mentioned something that is actually very important. You said this revolutionary idea that individuals would have rights, and what happens when this idea is put on the table at the international level in an international context like the UN at the time. Your book opens with a description of the context we were in when the first idea of a universal declaration emerged. So we're just after the adoption of the Charter of the United Nations. So help us a little bit understand what was the situation in the world at that time. Of course, there was this trauma of the Second World War having been so immense, so heavy on the entire humankind and the equilibrium, the balance among states. But there was more at play in the conscience of people and states at that time. Can you help us understand that context?
So we're in 1946, so right after the adoption of the UN Charter, and the UN Charter sets the mandate for United Nations as an organization and for its member states, mentioning the need for member states to respect human rights. And these human rights were then being listed in the Declaration of Human Rights. But it was not really evident at this time whether human rights or whether the idea of rights would be referring to member states' rights, the rights of member states to sovereignty, etc., or whether we were actually talking about individuals' human rights. And this was a debate that would then be focused on people's individual human rights. But so we're at the end of the Second World War. There had been 2 world wars, and it's important to understand that at these meetings, images were still being showcased. The atrocities of the Second World War, of the Holocaust, were becoming faced by international media, showing images from the Holocaust and what had happened during the Nazi regime. And people were really shocked to see how governments could turn against their own populations, how the German people could have lived, just close by concentration camp without this knowledge being spread and images being spread all over Europe. So people were shocked. There was a need to regain a faith in the dignity of human beings. And in when we think about women and women's roles, so women were in minority at these deliberations. There were only maybe 1 or 2 women representatives in each delegation. Very few at the San Francisco conference where the UN Charter was being adopted, but also very few during the 2 years when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being debated. So how come women actually got a voice in these negotiations? I think this was actually, in one way, a window of opportunity, because women had taken a different role during the Second World War. Women had become breadwinners of families in many countries. They've been factory workers, maybe not organized as well in labor unions. So this idea of equal pay for work was not really a reality, but something that they would voice at the United Nations, gender equality in relation to equal pay. Women in many countries had voted for the first time in national elections, also in European countries, because the 2 world wars had delayed suffrage. So there was also this sense of solidarity in the suffrage movement, because this was the first time when then the right to vote, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, whether you had property or not. So there was a lot of things that would limit universal suffrage related to class, to race, to gender, to age, etc. And this was a movement and an idea that, you need a universal suffrage, and people in many parts of the world had not experienced that. But there was also then a sense of solidarity above national borders. And I think this is really important to take into account. Women had taken part in independence movements, as in India and what would be the establishment of Pakistan. Women had served in prison for their boycotting of colonial administration and economic oppression through very unequal, of course, trade agreements, etc. And also then women in African countries had, started to take active part in political demands against colonial administrations when, their husbands were being imprisoned or forced to unpaid labor. So even though there were very few women then taking active role in international politics through the UN, They had experience of working, being breadwinners, having the right to vote for the first time. There was also increased sense of responsibility as a citizen and not just as someone in the private sphere. So women's role in the public had shifted during both these world wars. So that was the kind of another side of, from a feminist perspective, of women being able to push the limits for what they could talk about, and seeing that issues that concerned their lives, their families, were political issues that they had experience of. They now had experience of voting and of working and being, having economic responsibilities in their families. And there was also a faith in the UN to place pressure on colonial powers for human rights and for people living under, in non-self-governing territories. And the right to self-determination was mentioned already in the Atlantic Charter. So people who had fought against the Axis, they also had a faith in the United Nations to push for self-determination. There was a faith in ECOSOC, UN Economic and Social Council, that this body would have an even greater role than the Security Council. And I think this is a fascinating part of where the world was then, consciously, because there was this idea of the Economic and Social Council could work through deliberations and with a more fair economic development and social cooperation between member states that could prevent future wars, and that would even decrease the importance of the Security Council. I mean, this is an ideal that we've seen has not really become a reality. But there was also this renewed hope after these two world wars that peace finally would mean democracy in more countries in reality, and also realization and a respect for what was not being coined as international and universal human rights. So I also think that the collaboration and that was needed, to rebuild infrastructure in societies after world created an opportunity for a little bit more solidarity than maybe we would have if we had worked today with such documents.
You mentioned the situation we were in, and you mentioned also the space that women had for themselves in what we call international politics at that time. So it's very clear that there is this trend of women having shifted their position also especially during the Second World War. When we look at how the Universal Declaration was negotiated, it is undeniable, and you make that point in your book, that there is also an influence of the previous negotiation of the Charter. And we know that some key women had key roles in making the Charter what it is today. And it was adopted in 1945. So in what way exactly that experience played and connected, if it was the case, the two negotiating processes? Meaning, was the space that women had in the negotiation of the Human Rights Declaration a consequence of the good work some of them, especially from the Global South, one should add, did in San Francisco?
Yes. This is a really good question, because I think that the experiences that a few women had from the San Francisco conference really laid the groundwork for how they would then negotiate during the Declaration of Human Rights. So at the San Francisco conference, you had only 4 women signing the charter. You had Bertha Lutz from Brazil. You had Minerva Bernardino from the Dominican Republic. You had Virginia Gildersleeve from the U.S. and Yu Weifang from China. In official documents, it's been said that, the women at the San Francisco conference championed women's rights. That was not really the case. It was a little bit more complex than that. The women delegates from Brazil and the Dominican Republic, together with other Latin American women who were advisors or secretaries in different delegations, they created a strong alliance and solidarity among each other because they found out and experienced rather quickly that they would not gain the support that they thought that they would have from Western women delegates at the San Francisco conference. They were really disappointed by this. Virginia Gildersleeve, for example, in the US delegation, she felt that it was unnecessary to talk about women's human rights or gender equality because women were naturally included in the idea of all men or the rights of man. So, and I think this is also a very fascinating historical fact that in 1946, it was actually the Latin American feminists from the Global South who were really arguing for the need to explicitly mention gender equality in the UN Charter, to explicitly mention the need for a commission on the status of women, because they felt and they had very strong support for feeling that a commission with only men, a human rights commission, would not adequately deal or include issues related to women's rights. And they felt that you needed a commission with only women at the United Nations and at the founding of the United Nations, because women were in such a marginalized position because there were so few of them. Men were really in majority. If you look at images and photos from the San Francisco conference and the debates, especially about the Security Council, you will see rows and rows. These are really beautiful black and white photos of men in costumes smoking cigars, and there's a lot of cigar smoke in these rooms. There was a really male-dominated climate and atmosphere, but in these rooms you had very strong feminists like Bertha Lutz from Brazil, who was a politician and with a very strong political voice, stating that the few women at the San Francisco conference who were there needed to represent and ensure that half of the world's population, women, were being included in the notion of human rights. And they succeeded at the San Francisco conference to include Article 8 of the Charter, saying that women should also have the right to hold positions in UN bodies and the Secretariat. They managed to include sex in the non-discrimination list. They also ensured gender equality to be mentioned in the preamble, and also to at least raise the question that you needed a commission on the status of women under ECOSOC. And the Commission on the Status of Women was initially a subcommission under the Commission on Human Rights, but they gained an independent status, and they were able to have representatives in all meetings where the Universal Declaration was being debated. So this was really important. I think that this was something also that created a kind of sisterhood, especially between women from the Global South, from India, from Latin American countries, who knew that if you would not mention women explicitly in the wording, human rights would not be seen as including women in their countries. They also drew on the experience that they had a great support from international women's organizations. At the end of World War II, women had organized in international organizations from, the League of Nations and under the wars in different kinds of solidarity actions for peace, to help children also who had children were really such victims of the two world wars. So these international organizations, they collected food and things for children in Europe and in other countries, but also for universal suffrage. So there was a kind of solidarity as well as conflicts between women from different delegations. So it's a kind of a complex history, but the experience from the San Francisco conference showed that there could be alliances among women beyond national borders, and that there was a need for a commission with women where they could meet and talk about, so what were the issues that women needed to lift at the United Nations, that women from all the member states that were being represented at the UN shared as a common experience of their rights not being respected, but also issues that they needed to raise for women who had not any representation at the UN, women living in non-self-governing territories. And this actually very much thanks to women from newly dependent states, that you had an inclusion of stating in the Universal Declaration that human rights includes human rights for people living under non-self-governing territories. So that would include colonies, mandates on the trusteeship council, etc. So or occupied territories, ensuring that the political status of certain territories would not negate the idea that they also had human rights, and they could claim human rights, even though that was not a reality, a lived reality. But the women in these negotiations, they knew that if you struggle for something, even against colonial administrations, at least there was a rhetoric weapon to use against colonial oppression.
So this link is strong. The link between how the negotiation of the Charter went and how the nascent discussions on a universal Declaration of Human Rights, that link is very strong. And thank you for setting it out so clearly. Now let's dive into it. Your book is so rich. You describe the Commission of Human Rights and the contradistinction with the rights of man. You go into the Commission on the Status of Women with this perspective of sisterhood. And you mentioned this solidarity. We should not forget that solidarity was a strong ingredient in what happened during those negotiations. So let's dive in, for the benefit of our audience, an overview of your studies in this book, the findings that you found with respect to how this body of human rights law emerged during those negotiations, and the role, of course, of these women that were championing, that were fighting, struggling, and they knew, you used that so many times, these women knew what was at stake. They knew where to set the bar so that their sisters around the world wouldn't lose traction on their rights. So off you go with the overview of this wonderful book.
Thank you so much. So I see this work on women's role in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a kind of counter-narrative to earlier research into the drafting of the Declaration. So earlier accounts that I had been reading that were dominant at the time when I was working with this research had focused solely on the role of U.S. Delegate Eleanor Roosevelt as the chair of the Human Rights Commission that was working with the Declaration. Earlier historical accounts at that time had also looked into the drafting committee that made the first drafts of the Declaration and the male delegates there. You had male delegates from China and from Lebanon, for example. So you had other religious ideas connected to international human rights. However, the presence of women in this process over 2 years had been mostly overlooked. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight was, even though in the Commission on Human Rights, you only had 2 women delegates. You had Eleanor Roosevelt, but besides Eleanor Roosevelt, you had Hansa Mehta from India. And Hansa Mehta, she was the one who suggested that Eleanor Roosevelt would be elected chair in the Commission on Human Rights. She was also the first one to mention and react to the fact that the first draft said all men are born equal. She said that all men is not an inclusive wording. Her suggestion, and the suggestion also voiced by representatives from the Commission on the Status of Women to change this to all human beings, was voted down at least once in the debates by other delegates. But later it shifted, the language shifted from all men to all human beings. And I think this was thanks to the Hansa Mehta and other women representatives. Hansa Mehta was both the second woman in the Commission on Human Rights, but she was also representative and part of the Commission on the Status of Women. So in the Commission on the Status of Women, she had great support from other women delegates from Latin America, from India, from China, from Turkey, Lebanon, and other countries, but also women delegates from European countries in ensuring that, the right to education, for example, would be right for both boys and girls. And I think that her presence was really important in many regards. So during the colonial administration of India, the right to education for women had been really low. So illiteracy was really high in India among women after the independence. This is something that they changed in a very strong way. And I think that this is also experience of other countries that finally gained independence from colonial rule, was that under colonialism, education was not being afforded to everyone. So people were held illiterate and were being exploited in unpaid labor and etc. So that's part of a colonial administration to keep people uneducated. And unfortunately, I think that this is also a problem that we have today, that we talk about only primary education and not really ensuring higher education and universities in all countries and local universities and national universities. It's a way to rob people both of knowledge and the right to their own history, etc., etc. Because if you influence people's education, you can influence what kind of knowledge is being spread in a society. But so Hansa Mehta knew that girls' right to education was really important for their right to take part in political, in politics, and for the right to vote, for economic rights, and also to counter child marriages, for example, that women needed earn education and means to earn their own living and not be forced into child marriages, etc. So for her, economic and social and cultural rights were really dependent on political and civil rights. So Hansa Mehta, she wanted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights not just to be a mere declaration. She wanted it to become a binding convention, that human rights were going to become a legal reality, a social and political reality of people. She also wanted the International Court of Human Rights to become a reality and to hold member states accountable for human rights atrocities. I think, or I saw in the meeting protocols when I looked at the debates, that male delegates from the UK, for example, who initially said that, well, the rights of man is something that we, it's part of our history and this is something that we believe very strongly in. They felt more and more threatened by the very strong rhetoric by, for example, Hansa Mehta, when she argued that we needed to make a reality of these rights, we needed to hold member states accountable. And then colonial powers understood that they would be held accountable and that they could not just hide behind this rhetoric of human rights. Unfortunately, after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, when Eleanor Roosevelt and Hansa Mehta wanted to ensure that there was an international convention on human rights being adopted by the General Assembly, it was voted down. So they had to divide it into two covenants. So that's why we now have a first generation of rights, political, civil, and a second generation of rights of economic, social, and cultural rights. I think that's a real shame that the Cold War created such division, because the division of human rights into different parts does not really acknowledge the dependence of different rights on others, and especially I think from a feminist perspective, where women's right in the private is connected to the rights in the public. If you do not have the right to decide over your future, if you do not have the economic means to make your own choices in life, it's really difficult to talk about other types of rights as well. And also the understanding that a lot of women have that we needed women in politics in order to change and question the discriminatory legislation in place in many countries that disregarded rights of women. So we had Hansa Mehta then in the Commission on Human Rights, being supported by Minerva Bernardino, who was the chair of the Commission on the Statutes of Women, but also other women delegates from China. Begum Ali, for example, she wanted the declaration also to mention monogamy should be mentioned, that men should not have the right to have several wives, for example. This was not being included, of course, in the declaration. The Commission on the Statutes of Women, as they had, even though they had representatives in all meetings, so they could raise their concerns. They could ask questions to the delegates. Why had they, for example, in earlier drafts, taken away the mentioning of gender equality in the preamble? So you mentioned it in the UN Charter, in the preamble of the UN Charter, men and women are equal. Then taking away that in a draft of the preamble of the Universal Declaration. And also Hélène Lefaucheux from France, who had received the Croix de Guerre at the end of World War II for resistance against Nazi occupation. She ensured that sex was being included again in the non-discrimination list of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But so I think that the presence of the women representatives, even though they could not vote on certain changes in the articles, they could raise their concerns, and they could ensure that their presence would be uncomfortable for the mostly male delegates of the Human Rights Commission, who might consciously or unconsciously overlook things that had to do with women. The U.S. delegation was, for example, against the inclusion of Article 16 of rights in marriage and at its dissolution, which meant that they didn't want women's rights in the private to be included in the idea of human rights. They said that human rights should be only civil and political rights. But as women delegates from other countries had experienced that, if women do not have any rights in the private, they will not have any rights in the political. The article was nonetheless kept in the declaration. I think this was very radical also at the time, because it mentions the right to divorce, and this was not a lived reality of women from many countries at the time. So And then the declaration went to the third committee of the General Assembly. But then we have new women delegates from Pakistan, for example, Shaista Ikramullah, who's part of drafting the constitution of first constitution of Pakistan, being part of the deliberations as well. So the deliberations also in Geneva were really interesting at the end of the process.
This is actually something I wanted to ask you, see whether it comes up in a certain light in your research. So it's really a question for you. When I found out, preparing for this episode, I found out the fact that I think three initial drafts of the declaration were negotiated in Geneva back in December 47. And by the way, this is a declaration that could have taken an immense time to negotiate, but actually it went through very quickly. It was the negotiating process lasted 2 years. And so can you tell us more about what happened in Geneva and how significant were those negotiations to adopting the declaration as we know it today?
So the negotiations were in Palais des Nations in Geneva, and this is known as the heart of the United Nations human rights work. And I just wanted to mention that in French, it's droit de l'homme, and the Commission on the Status of Women questioned this wording in French, and they suggested droit de l'homme FM, but the French delegates felt that would be an unnecessary repetition in wording, and that women, femme, were included in l'homme. So they were going to consider the report from the subcommission on the prevention of discrimination and protection of minorities in Geneva, both the Human Rights Commission and the Commission on the Status of Women. And this would affect the non-discrimination list of Article 2 in the declaration, which is really important. And here I come back to Helene Lefaucheux, because there was an omission of sex discrimination in the draft that was being discussed. And she said that, this must have been an oversight on Mr. Borisov on his part. He was the male delegate from the Soviet Union. And when she did say this, the chair of the discussions, Charles Malik from Lebanon, thanked Lefaucheux, and he also expressed his satisfaction that there was a presence of members from the Commission on the Status of Women in these debates. But what happened here, and this is the only time actually in the meeting protocols that I saw this, it says that Mr. Roy from Haiti, he had to raise a point of order in view of the demurs that were voiced by some members when they said that sex would be included in the non-discrimination list. So non-discrimination against women seemed like that was not like an evident thing to discuss. Possibly several delegates felt like this was something that should not really be included in declarations. So they had to have a point of order in the room due to this. Another thing that was being raised in Geneva, which I thought was interesting, was Mr. Duke from the UK. In Article 1, he wanted a footnote stating that men in the declaration refers to all human beings. So because the representatives from the Commission on the Status of Women said that men was not really including women. But he said, well, maybe we can have a footnote in the declaration stating that. But so all men was still being used in the Geneva draft, but this was being, again, taken up later and changed.
How did that happen? I remember reading your book that there is this famous quote from one of the women delegates saying, "Men does not mean women." So how did it happen, this transition? How was this point overcome during the negotiations?
So this was being taken up again by Hansa Mehta later on in the discussions in the Commission on Human Rights, saying that if we use the wording men, it will not mean women in India. And the wording was actually being changed. Eleanor Roosevelt said that she was responding to Hansa Mehta at that point, saying that, this is a language issue and all men is an inclusive language, etc. In that sense, I think she was a little bit more blinded to the male-biased language of the declaration. The Commission on the Statues of Women, through Hansa Mehta, ensured that all men was being changed to all human beings. But they also wanted sisterhood to be mentioned in addition to brotherhood. They wanted not only his and him to be the language of the declaration, but also her and hers. This was not changed because other delegates felt like that would be a strange way of writing. Today, I think we would have wanted both his, hers, theirs in the declaration to have it even more inclusive.
Yeah, of course, today the language has evolved. At that time, there was also something that still exists today in very technical text, is this mirror translations. For example, the words in English that wouldn't translate the same way in French. And I think I read in your book that this was also an issue taken up by, that took time during the negotiations, isn't it? Yes.
They wanted, as I mentioned, not just droit de l'homme, but droit de l'homme FM.
That is a good example. And still today, actually, the name of the Human Rights Council in French and the name of the overall name used in the UN is droit de l'homme. With an evolution that is there that uses more droit humain. So that seems more a translation of human rights. So in English, some things are easier than in French, and I imagine also vice versa. But this is also a good segue in a next and final part of our conversation today. I wanted to tap into your knowledge in terms of gender historical analysis of human rights, and I really wonder, when you look at this dimension, what emerges when we look at the history of human rights from a gender historical point of view. We saw the role of these women. We saw through your analysis that what they knew, what they held for true, actually played a role and motivated them in their struggle, because it was a struggle in diplomatic terms, but also in political terms, as you highlighted minutes ago. So when we look, for example, at the contradistinction between the universality of human rights as a concept and the specificity of women's rights, how was that perceived? What is the state of play today? How do we make sense of that contract distinction?
No, through a feminist reading of this historical process, one thing that becomes really clear is that as a reader, you need to be aware that wordings that are being used at the time were not inclusive. That's why you need explicit mentioning of women or children or people living under colonial rule. For example, who was included in the notion of the worker with economic rights and the right to equal pay? Who was being included in the notion of a citizen with voting rights? People needed to be explicitly mentioned in order to be included in such a notion. So if you look at reports and meeting protocols also from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, you will see that their understanding was also that, you had a male worker and a male worker with rights, or even though not stating male, it was evident that the worker is a male breadwinner, family breadwinner. What does a man need to earn in order to pay for his family? Coming back then to how I started talking about my interest in this history. So earlier historical accounts that have just looked at the notion of human rights and then dating that back to the French Revolution or the American Declaration of Independence, I think that shows a misguided understanding of what human rights is in the terms as it's used in UN conventions and UN declarations, because at the founding of the United Nations, that was the time when you had a more inclusive understanding of human rights, including women, including people living under colonial rule. If you look at the French Revolution, French women risked their lives when they tried to argue that women should be included as citizens. They could be seen as threats to the state and be killed for that, but they did not have voting rights. So it was not an inclusive concept. The idea of rights also in earlier US declarations were also excluding people, women, people who did not own property, and the civil rights movement, which came after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, really shows that civil rights and political rights, as they were being debated at the UN, were not really inclusive. And there are really fascinating accounts of how women organizations in the US, Black women, used the wording of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after its adoption to argue for their civil and political rights. And I think that it's important also when we talk about, the suffrage movement was a very lively debate in many countries. And we cannot just look at the date in history when property-owning men received the right to vote, or when all men received the right to vote, or when a few women received the right to vote. I think that it's important to include, so when did indigenous women receive the right to vote in different countries? And then you will have a totally different timeline for when suffrage has become a reality in many countries. So I think that that's one of the gains with taking a feminist analysis, is being mindful of who's being included and who is still being excluded.
Well, this is fascinating and actually offers really a reading into the development of human rights. And this concept of what's inclusive also that you explained to us, it's really useful in understanding beyond the wording, beyond the use of words in text, on pages of declarations. It really opens up a lot of interesting spaces there. So thank you for that. I wanted to go back to some of these women figures that I met during the book. Reading your book, there is a series of fascinating historical, impressive women, I would say. I wanted to, as we go towards the conclusion of the episode, I wanted to hear from you. You have lived during your research, sitting next to these women, reading these primary sources that are basically the notes of these meetings and these negotiations. Who are those who impressed you the most?
Well, several women and of different reasons. So, of course, Hansa Mehta impressed me a lot since she was working alongside Mahatma Gandhi in the independence movement. She was jailed twice for her resistance. She ensured that thousands of Indian women demonstrated, and she also married out of love against her family. So she was a very inspiring revolutionary woman, and in the photos she sits in her sari and sandals at the UN meetings. She had a lot of respect from the other women delegates due to her experiences and how she's been part of also the work with the Constitution of India. I mean, she's very inspiring. And then Minerva Bernardino from the Dominican Republic, and her work in the Commission on the Status of Women, I think is fascinating because she was orphaned early on. She had to make her own living. She moved to the US. She was in one sense representing dictatorship, a non-democratic regime, but she was really speaking with her own voice, and she was speaking for democracy, and I think she was part of those Latin American women at the time who felt that through an international organization you could place pressure on national governments to ensure that women's rights were being respected. I think she's really fascinating because she was a real international figure in many senses, because she did not really abide, I think, to her own, to just representing her own country. She kind of find her own way in UN negotiations. And then Shaista Ikramullah from Pakistan in the third committee, she had actually been moved from the commission that was dealing with the Convention Against Genocide, because her male colleagues felt that she got and received too much kudos for her beautiful, passionate speeches against genocide in that commission. So she was moved to the third committee. I think that several male delegates did not think that the Declaration of Human Rights would be so important as it has shown us to. It has customary law status today, and it's a very important document of the United Nations. And then another figure that I've been very inspired by is Lakshmi Menon from India. And the reason why I'm so inspired by her is that, well, for one, an interesting fact is that she didn't want to be part of any photos or be seen so much publicly. So there are very few photos of her in the UN archives and the media archives. But the speeches that she held were so strong. She was one of the delegates who always ensured to mention people living under non-self-governing territories, under colonial rule. She was very critical of colonial administration and hypocrisy of Western delegates who spoke about human rights but did not really ensure that this became a reality and realization in the territories that they oppressed. I think that she's very inspiring because she was so strong in her speeches, but she was not really seen so much. And I think as an academic and someone who wants to just sit in archives, but just to, work with documents, and I'm really fascinated with just knowledge and what could be found, and not wanting to be seen so much. I think that she as a figure I could really relate to that, of being very passionate about something that you believe in very strongly, but then maybe not wanting to be seen so much.
I see that. I understand that. As we draw this to a conclusion, Rebecca, in your book, there isn't really a chapter called Conclusions, but there is an epilogue that I like very much on female representation in the UN. So what are your final thoughts linked to this analysis that you have done in your book, but also more generally on this point of women representation in what is the modern, multilateral system today?
So when I wrote the book, we in Sweden, even though we've been champion women's rights, at that time we hadn't had a single female head of state. And in a lot of other countries, Latin American and African countries, you've had very strong head of states, female head of states, and I think that's very inspiring. When it comes to the United Nations, I think that one of the challenges is that we have, for example, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, but we do not really have enough children being heard or being part of negotiations about their own rights, and also the importance of having minorities in all countries being represented at the UN. I don't want to call women a minority, because women constitute half of the population of the world, but still, if we see this as like a possible democratic idea, that you should have representation, then we're kind of failed in many regards, because that's not how it looks like at UN. And I think it's also disheartening to see how the Commission on the Statutes of Women still need to relate to members with consultative status that do not have any female representatives and who question the very core and basic human rights of women, like the right to vote or right to contraceptives, to divorce, to against child marriages, etc., that people need to continue arguing for very basic human rights against interests that are not personally affected maybe by the rights that they limit, but have a lot of influence in deciding on other people's rights. And I mean, this is the situation in all countries, that heterosexuals take the right to decide rights for other people that do not really influence themselves. And we still have a neo-colonial structure where Western countries continue to exploit and set standards when it comes to not paying taxes in countries where they exploit both labor and resources, etc. So it's a democracy is a continuous process. And I think that the United Nations is a very interesting organization because it comprises of member states with different political systems. But there is an international organization where people actually do meet and where there are negotiations and discussions and diplomatic discussions on these issues. And I think that generates hope, because as long as people meet over differences and discuss things and you can raise voices of dissent, there's a hope for change. So I think that the United Nations, there's a lot of critique against the organization, of course, but I think it's a very inspiring endeavor.
Well, I could not agree more. Sitting here in this Palais des Nations, looking at you through the screen, but I'm sitting here in Geneva, the cradle of many parts of multilateralism, and the house of human rights. I couldn't agree more with you. Well, Rebecca Adami, thank you for taking time to be on the podcast with us. Congratulations for this enlightening book, and we wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Francesco, for inviting me.